Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. And just a gentle reminder that today's webinar and presentation will be recorded. And I will put the link in the chat box. You can find the recording at the Business Climate Leaders website following the event. And just very quickly, as Randy had mentioned, please use the chat box for questions. We're going to open up for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. And we welcome any comments and hope that you'll share a little bit about your work and how this may be relevant to you. Just very quickly, Dan is a federal project director for the U.S. Department of Energy at Argonne, and his work contributes to the innovative ecosystem of world-class laboratories, universities, and businesses in Chicago. Dan previously served in the U.S. Navy as a lieutenant and nuclear engineer on a ballistic missile submarine, and is an active supporter of the veteran community. In 2016, Dan founded the Veterans Advanced Energy Summit to educate other military veterans on global energy security challenges. Dan is a member of the Truman National Security Project and a Take Point Fellow with the Atlantic Council. He was named to the Midwest Energy News 40 Under 40 and a Call to Service finalist for the Chicago Federal Executive Board Awards in 2017. Dan received a BS in Physics from the U.S. Naval Academy and an MA in Public Policy from the University of Chicago. And Dan, I'm going to let you share your screen if you want to start and tell us a little bit more about the summit and your work. Thank you.
So Steph, thank you for the introduction. Thank you to BCL for having me. This is not me pictured on the screen. That is Dustin Miner. Dustin is a Marine Corps artilleryman veteran, now a wind technician for Invenergy. Invenergy is just one of many companies out there now that recognizes the benefits of hiring military veterans. And that's because veterans gain very usable technical skills and operational experience through their work with energy systems that drive the military mission, both at home and abroad, as well as desirable soft skills like leadership, decision-making, and performance under pressure. Invenergy was actually one of the founding sponsors that helped me start the Veterans Advanced Energy Summit that helps educate other veterans on energy security and showing them how a career in energy can actually help veterans continue service to their country. So this is my version of the before and after photo. So Steph, as you mentioned, this is me as a young lieutenant driving a ballistic missile submarine off the coast of Seattle in the Pacific Ocean. So that's not the actual submarine that I'm sitting on, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what that was like. So I studied physics at the U.S. Naval Academy and served as a nuclear engineer. And I'm very fortunate today to have the job that I have with the Department of Energy at Argonne National Lab, where a lot of the technology that we're going to need in order to transition to a clean energy economy is being developed today. And I actually attribute a lot of my success in the transition out of the military to that mission and the feeling like I belong to something bigger than myself. You might actually be surprised to learn that oil, gas, and nuclear are outpacing clean energy in hiring military veterans. This is an article that I wrote earlier this year based on data from the U.S. Energy Employment Report, the 2019 U.S. Energy and Employment Report that was put up by the Energy Futures Initiative. And the data shown on the screen here shows you the change in veteran employment relative to each subsector within the energy industry. So on the left, you can see that wind, solar, and energy efficiency have actually gone down in 2018, whereas nuclear fuels and coal have gone up. I will point out that petroleum is on the left-hand side. So the veteran employment relative to the changes in the industry has gone down, but both veteran employment and the petroleum industry went up in 2018. So when we're talking about veterans and energy, or just energy employment in general, what exactly does that mean? there are 8 million energy jobs in America today, approximately 10% of which are held by military veterans. And that's actually better than the national average. Today, only about 6% of the US workforce are veterans. Within the energy industry, about half of the veterans that are there are working in clean energy jobs based on the classifications provided by the Chicago-based Clean Energy Trust. And so you can see that estimated breakdown here on the screen. The main takeaway, which is that energy efficiency is 75 or nearly 75% of all clean energy jobs. And 50% of the energy efficiency market is actually in construction. And so construction is kind of the surprising driver behind veteran employment in clean energy. So for folks that are interested in working with veterans, possibly recruiting them and retaining in their own businesses, I'd like to propose a framework here for how they might do that in engaging in programs that exist or that they may be interested in creating. The 3 areas that I summarize those are in preparation, to connect, and motivate veterans. So preparation starts really before a veteran takes off the uniform. That is the transition programs provided by the Department of Labor and the Department of Defense. It is interview prep, resume prep, and mentorships. In connecting, that is helping companies find the candidates and helping veterans find the companies that are interested in hiring. This could be networking events, job fairs, or internships, for example. And in motivation. So I think that work-life balance and pay are always going to be the primary factor when folks are making their decisions. But I'll also point out that military veterans are a group of people that are significantly driven by their mission and by an inherent need to serve their country. And as I'll discuss, if you can find ways to connect your business mission to national security, then you're likely to have a better chance of recruiting and retaining those veterans. So unemployment for military veterans is actually at an all-time low, only 2.5% in comparison to 3.5% across the national average. Unfortunately, women veterans are still 4.1%, which is below the national average, and military spouses actually have an astounding 24% unemployment rate today. In addition to those unemployment numbers, underemployment is something that is very important for considering when working with veterans. Today, 33% of veterans and 56% of military spouses are underemployed, and that can be underutilized, overqualified, or unfulfilled. So here is where the clean energy industry really has an opportunity to appeal to military veterans. By transitioning to a clean energy economy, we are going to reduce our reliance on foreign fuels. We're going to mitigate the national security impacts of climate change. We are making our energy systems more resilient against physical and cyber threats, as well as ensuring our future economic soft power through technological innovation. That is one of the major themes that we'll be discussing at the Veterans Advanced Energy Summit in Chicago. And it's actually the advice that I have for the folks that are looking now who may not necessarily be in clean energy, is finding how your mission aligns with national security and using that in your communication and outreach with military veterans who you may be interested in working with. So that is kind of the end of the core information that I plan to share today. And Steph and Randy, if we want to open it up for any questions.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for going over that and for sharing that. And we do have some questions that have been coming through. And the first one that came through was, why the drop in veterans working in clean energy?
Why the drop? I don't know that I have an answer for why the drop, but I can certainly speak to the challenges that the clean energy industry faces. I think that when you look at traditional energy companies, they do tend to be larger they're also probably going to have more money to spend on recruitment and involvement in existing mechanisms that help veterans transition. And I'm just thinking about big oil and gas. They're also, the hierarchy and the large organizations that are somewhat similar to the military. So I think that the clean energy companies that tend to be smaller and more nimble might have a harder time tapping into that veteran talent. And that's something that they need to specifically focus on.
And certainly, maybe you can speak to challenges that companies face in terms of being military hire ready, and like you said, preparing and connecting and retaining. So I think if we were to look at what it is that you'd like to see in the smaller entrepreneurial or advanced energy industry organizations that are coming online, what is it from the summit or from your work that you would want to make sure that they understood and were translating in their hiring practices?
Yeah, so I think some of the key practices that have been proven today would be that making sure that companies have HR representatives that are fluent in military language. So helping, we are trying to help military veterans translate their experience into the skills and tools that companies are going to be interested in, but it will help, of course, if those companies understand what some of the actual roles that there are in the military. The other thing is that a lot of times a veteran might not have a specific education or certification that would qualify them for an open position. And so certification programs are really helpful. The Solar Ready Vets was one of the most successful in this area, where active duty military personnel were able to get a solar installer certificate, which that they could then use to seek future employment. And that's a program that the Solar Foundation is looking to reboot as well as expand. So there was some recent legislation introduced by Senator Tammy Duckworth that would be taking a look at both wind and cyber as areas in the energy industry that veterans could get involved. And then lastly, I think that, especially in the entrepreneurial side of things, talking about the national security aspect of this and how these careers are contributing to our national security, helping veterans feel good about what they do and the choices that they're making after the military can really help improve the longevity that they have in the jobs that they choose.
Excellent. And does that expansion of the skilling and preparation, career preparedness, also include any kind of reskilling or reservist or veterans that are transitioning jobs as well?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Something similar to what you're providing with the summit. Do you see other organizations looking to expand on what Solar Ready Vets was doing with transitioning military to include reskilling or career preparedness for reservists or veterans that are currently underemployed or unemployed?
I do. I think that there is a large push for this right now. I think, reflected in both the Solar Foundation's efforts to reboot Solar Ready Vets and, like I said, the active legislation that's out there now. The Veterans Advanced Energy Summit is just one of many opportunities throughout the year that both veterans and energy and climate people can come together and talk about these kinds of issues. Another great group that's out there right now is Vets in Energy. This is a nonprofit out of DC that has their own national summit every fall, and they're coordinated in partnership with the Center for Energy Workforce Development. So very much looking at these exact same issues.
Great, thank you. Okay, and we have a number of questions. So I'll go to one from Bill. And the question is, where do you see nuclear energy fitting into our transition off of fossil fuels? So the advanced energy or clean energy transition.
That's a good question, because when I got out of the military after having spent 4 years studying physics and then 5 years becoming a nuclear engineer, I started learning more about climate change and wasn't so sure how I felt about nuclear energy anymore. And it's the reason why I'm glad I'm at Argonne, where nuclear energy was actually started, and where so many more things are happening now. So I personally believe in an all of the above approach. And part of the reason why we have the name we do as the Advanced Energy Summit is because those advances that are being made in nuclear to make it more productive and easier to implement are very important to the overall transition. I personally can't foresee a future without nuclear energy, but we obviously have some really major challenges, most specifically spent fuel. So the U.S. does not currently have a depository for this, and the government is paying the nuclear power plants to store that until we find a place to put it.
Okay, great. Thank you. There's a question here about how do you suggest, or how do you talk to veterans about climate change and global warming?
So we have some experience with this. The Veterans Advanced Energy Summit is now in its 3rd year. We've had 4 events to date, 2 in Chicago, where I'm based, as well as in San Diego and Boston. And in fact, we have had some trouble in the past talking about climate change and trying to connect the dots with advanced energy and with clean energy in general. So back in 2017, we had a great presentation from the Union of Concerned Scientists, who had done some studies about how seawater level rise is going to affect military bases on the coast. And the feedback that we got from the veterans was, what does this have to do with energy? And I think that that was a real learning point for us in being able to better connect the dots about how a transition into clean energy is going to, I guess, mitigate those effects. And so really tying the climate change to national security and explaining how, as you all know, that as the global temperatures continue to rise and seawater levels go up, that's going to affect us both at home and our mission abroad. So we're going to see increased conflict as a result of resource shortages. That's going to create international tension, as well as increased natural events that may affect the military mission overall. And I think that bringing those concepts to the attention of military veterans is one way that we can tie that back to climate change.
Excellent, thank you. And actually tying on to that is the next question, which is asking if you have specific data on the percentage of veterans that believe climate change is an issue. And is that a driver in them getting involved in clean energy, or is it just a job? So I think you've answered a portion of that, but is there anything else in terms of specific research that you've been able to produce through the summit or externally?
No, actually, that's a terrific question, and maybe one that I need to now go run and find the answer to, because these topics are something that the Atlantic Council is interested in. It's the reason why they're doing the summit this year. If I had to make a prediction, I would think that since the military is generally a conservative entity, and most soldiers would identify as such, that those politics may actually be influencing the perceptions that the active duty military people have about climate change. At the same time, the Department of Defense has been making great progress. Back in 2014, when the quarterly defense report finally identified climate change as a major risk, that may actually be alerting both military and veterans to the national security impacts that it's going to have. And yeah, that's a great question that I don't have data to back up.
And Dan, were you exposed to climate science or education around this at the Naval Academy?
No, not whatsoever. Really, it wasn't until after the Navy, when I was looking into a career in energy and in nuclear energy. It was 2012 during Obama's re-election campaign that climate change was really kind of at the forefront at those debates, that I started learning more about it. that I became interested in these topics.
Great. Well, what you're doing is extremely important. And the next question is, what businesses in defense industry would be most interested in action on climate change, especially carbon pricing? And Dan, just as a note, we haven't been as active in recent years, but we are reigniting the Business Climate Leaders Aerospace and Defense sector team. So actually, this is a great question for this group.
You know, I don't know that I can answer that question. I don't know if Randy has any insights on it. As to what defense businesses might have an interest in this.
Or here's another question, Dan. Do you, even if it's somewhat just a sense of it, what are some of the challenges or constraints that an organization or a business within the aerospace and defense industry might have in terms of publicly advocating for carbon pricing?
So I would think that a lot of companies, especially large defense companies, are somewhat siloed in their organization. They may not have a central office or even a specific office that's focused on climate change. And I think if you look at like what the State Department had done not that long ago about identifying an envoy to address these issues specifically, or in the Department of Energy where I am, creating a specific office to look at climate change, that would be one tactic that businesses might be able to use in order to prioritize the effects that climate change is going to have on their operations.
Okay, sure. Okay, and then we have just a couple more questions. I know we're almost at the bottom of the hour. So please, if anyone else has other questions, feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat box. There was another question here that says, how do we get more veterans involved in our climate work? And I think maybe they're mentioning that in terms of advocacy. Or solutions like carbon pricing, it says.
So I think that, as I've said, the national security angle is probably your best bet. At least from my personal experience, I signed up for the military when I was 17, so technically I think my parents signed the dotted line. And I personally looked at my service to serve the country as the mission and didn't think very much about politics or the direction that things were headed. And here is an opportunity that with the veterans as they're leaving the military to kind of engage their political brains in a new way. Events like the summit and groups like one that I'm a part of, the Truman National Security Project, that has what would I call it? A group of veteran advocates for clean energy because of the national security impacts of climate change are very important. And it's just about building that awareness and educating people on those topics so that they can continue to spread the good word.
Okay, great. And Dan, just before we finish up here, can you tell us a little bit more about the summit itself and some of the fellowship opportunities that you're offering?
I can. So the Veterans Advanced Energy Summit is now scheduled on August 13th in Chicago, Illinois. It is in partnership with the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, as well as Invenergy, Exelon, and a number of other partners like MacArthur Foundation. We will it's a one-day event that we will be looking at what brought all of us together, what are our shared experiences in the military with operational energy, and then taking a look at where things are going in the energy industry and how veterans have been engaged and can get engaged in those topics. The event is open to everybody that has an interest in the intersection of energy and national security, not just to veterans. And we also are encouraging military spouses and veteran spouses to also get engaged. I talked about how veterans gain those technical skills, but there's a lot more than just the technical in terms of the jobs that are available out there that military spouses can also play a role in being able to support.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dan. And just one last open invitation for anyone to ask any questions about the summit, about any kind of sector work. I put some links in the chat box for the vetsenergysummit.org, as well as the businessclimateleaders.org website, where we will have the recording for today's event. Okay, and with that, Dan, thank you again for your presentation, for all the work that you're doing, and we look forward to having you on one of these webinars again in the near future. We'd love to hear how the event went, and thank you everyone for joining us today.